Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 27, Section 2, talking about World War One. And just to kind of recap from what we mentioned in Section 1, Europe, kind of leading into 1914, had been divided into a couple different major alliances. You might remember hearing a little bit about the Triple Alliance, which included Germany, Austria Hungary, and Italy to start with. And then they also had the Triple Entente, which was the United Kingdom or Great Britain, France, and Russia. And as the war kind of starts happening, Italy is going to drop out of the Triple Alliance, and Turkey or the Ottoman Empire is going to join, and they're going to be renamed into the Central Powers. And the Triple Alliance or Triple Entente is going to be eventually just known as the Allies. And eventually, Italy and the United States are going to join up with that side. As a result of these alliances, we're going to see a lot of changes when we talk about warfare as far as how it's going to be fought. When the war began, uh, kind of in the late summer of 1914, I think a lot of the countries thought that this would be a very short-lived war, not thinking that the uh, advent of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that we had more modern weapons would actually change how war would be fought. Eventually, we're going to have a grinding war of attrition. And there's going to be trenches that are going to be dug. Initially, those first trenches were just literally just trenches in the ground. But by the time we get to about 1916, there are hundreds upon hundreds of miles of elaborate trenches that have been dug throughout parts of uh, Western Europe. When you talk about countries like Belgium and France, definitely they were scarred for years by these trenches that were dug during the First World War. So that land in between these trenches is actually known as no man's land because it is a dangerous area, and because of the fact that we have all these wonderful modern weapons. If you were a person who was outside of your trench for just a moment of time, you were really playing with your fate. Uh, Barbed wire, razor wire, landmines, machine guns, uh, poisonous gas, any of those kind of things could be out there to greet you in no man's land. As a result of the stalemate in these trenches, we had new weapons that were developed. Gas warfare is going to come on the scene, and we're going to mention a few things about that here in a moment. You had tanks, which were built and designed to basically bust through uh, this no man's land. And eventually, we're going to start using aircraft, not only for surveillance, but actually for strategic bombings and such. Not to mention the fact that you're going to improve the machine gun and the howitzer, and you're going to use secret coded messages. Uh, when you're talking about the sea, you're going to see the use of submarines or U-boats by the Germans. All of these things become incredibly dangerous for any given soldier or sailor during this period of time. So I mentioned the tank a moment ago. The British were the first to invent the tank, and I would have to say the tank itself was kind of a work in progress during the First World War. Um, Initially designed to kind of get across no man's land, not necessarily one that was really reinforced for the dangers that were lurking out there. A lot of times, people who were in these tanks understood the danger because of the fact that the steel that was plating most tanks was relatively thin, and it was possible that some of the ammunition that your enemy was using would pierce this armor and literally make this a metal coffin. So dangerous, but needless to say, the British were the first, and eventually the Germans are going to be making them, and the U.S. is going to make them, and the French are going to make them, and needless to say, it's going to kind of spark an arms race here. When we talk about strategic bombings, one of the things that we should note is when aircrafts were first used during the beginning of this war, it was primarily to get kind of a bird's eye view to see where your enemy was at. And over a period of time, our enemies are going to figure out that they have a certain advantage being up at that elevation. Initially, pilots were given pistols, and if they happen to be kind of in close range of another pilot, they might be able to take their firearm out and shoot at their enemy. But there's some dangers with that. You know, you have a propeller, and somebody thought that it would probably be best to actually rig a gun that would be mounted on a plane, but also put a timing mechanism so that as the um, machine gunner is pulling on the trigger, that it would actually have a pause as the propeller goes through, and so in a fraction of a second you could fire that machine gun, but not necessarily hit the blade of the propeller. Great engineering, but our enemies were also using things like zeppelins, which were German dirigible aircraft, or like blimps. And there was actually a bombing campaign that happened in London where um, the people flying these zeppelins would actually take grenades and pull the pins and just drop them outside of their blimps or their zeppelins, and it had a psychological effect. But needless to say, war is now really coming to a place near you. It's becoming something that civilians are going to be faced with. When we talk about gas warfare, this is kind of a work in progress. When you talk about one of the first battles that we would see gas warfare used, maybe in a kind of a sinister kind of way, you got to talk about the Battle of the Second Ypres, which happened kind of around 1915, 1916, where the Germans actually used poisonous gas against Canadian or British troops. But really, if you go back a little bit before there, the French military was using tear gas against the Germans, and they started that as early as 1914. And as the war progresses, so does the type of gases that are going to be used. Up at the top of the slide, there's a kind of a photograph of somebody's hand, and that is actually an individual who was exposed to mustard gas. Not necessarily a gas that's going to cause a lot of um, fatalities. I mean, it's possible, but at the same time, it can cause a lot of damage to the skin with burning and such. As a result, most of our troops are going to be eventually equipped with gas masks, and not only are the troops, but their colleagues, like your dogs, like you see there with the German troops, or the horses, or in some cases mules, would have their own mask, just so that they could protect them and keep them safe from harm during the battles. When we talk about propaganda, this was something that was going to be used by both sides, both our enemy and the allies, as a way to influence certain countries to continue to participate. Even the United States would get involved in this. The familiar image of Uncle Sam that you see there on your screen was something that we saw here in the United States to kind of encourage young men to participate in the war or register for the draft. But it's the idea that by winning the hearts and the minds of people, you could actually really kind of change the morale of a nation to kind of back a war. The other one that you see there is one that is, again, an American-made piece of propaganda that was kind of aimed at the Germans. The Germans were sometimes known as the Huns, barbaric. And you can kind of see that depicted within this piece of art, the green eyes, the blood on the hands, and the bayonet, with the hope that maybe that would stir a person back home to help support the war by buying a Liberty bond to finance it. So propaganda and censorship. These were used during the war because it could unify people to support the war effort, but it also kept people from knowing the true extent of what was really happening. Even in the United States, we were using censorship to kind of downplay those people who were big critics of the war. And not only did you see that here in the US, but you would have seen it in places like France and Great Britain and Germany and such. Let's talk about the battles here. You know, one of the first battles that was fought uh, in the Western Front of World War One was actually the first Battle of the Marne, which actually took place shortly after the war began. So um, kind of later summer 1914. This was a battle that took place just outside of Paris. The Germans, trying to be sneaky, kind of went through Belgium to kind of attack the French. And this is where the French troops and the British troops first met the Germans. And this battle was happening so fast that the French military had to find a unique way to get their soldiers to the battlefront. And the story goes that they pretty much commandeered all the available taxis that were in the city of Paris to haul hundreds of troops out to the front line. Kind of an interesting story, but this is basically a battle that's going to kind of give us a foreshadowing of what's going to happen for the rest of the war, because this battle ended in a stalemate. In other words, there wasn't really a clear, decisive winner here. On the Eastern Front, which would be basically the border between Germany, Austria Hungary, and Russia, you had a couple of battles that also took place in the late summer of 1914. The Battle of Tannenberg, and shortly thereafter, the Battle of Massaran Lake. These were battles where the Germans definitely had the upper hand, and in a way, kind of set the tone for what was going to happen in Russia. You know, when the Russians were losing this, um, the first couple of battles here, the support for the war back home really started to wane. And the next thing you know, we're going to have chaos that's going to start brewing in Russia. On the Russian front, France and Germany both suffered enormous casualties in the Battle of Verdun and Somme. Matter of fact, when you talk about the city of Verdun, there were roughly 700,000 French soldiers who were killed in that battle. That's an enormous figure. That's more than the number of Americans killed throughout World War II. So that's an amazingly high number, and certainly, definitely had an impact on the psyche of people as far as their support for the war. The Germans were defeated or defeated the British in the Third Battle of the Ypres, and the front line remained unchanged for a period of time. In other words, this trench line became basically, a fortified line because it wasn't moving anywhere, and thus all the need for these fancy weapons to kind of move people around a little bit. World War One was truly a world war because over 30 nations officially took sides and fought this war, not only with troops from Europe, but also there were some battles that took place in Asia, the Pacific, and also in Africa. The war stalemate also influenced warring nations because they had to look elsewhere for ways to win. One of the battles that we should kind of keep in the back of our minds that isn't necessarily one that's thought a lot about, but it was a really bad battle, is the Battle of Gallipoli. The special defensive position controlled by the Ottoman Empire was this thing called the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles is like a strait that really kind of goes from part of the Eastern Mediterranean into the Black Sea. If you can kind of see the little insert map down below. And this is not very far from present day Greece or present day Turkey. But this little inlet could actually allow the Allies to move supplies to the Russians. And the Ottoman understood if they held this, they could, really kind of shut down the Russians as a result of that. So the British, okay, including troops from Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, basically staged a battle here to go after the Ottoman and to open this up. And what this basically comes down to is a slaughter. Um, the Ottoman held the higher ground, and for months on end, the British would send wave after wave to attack, and basically to no avail. They would be pushed back or slaughtered in certain battles, and needless to say, it's going to take a little bit of time before the British realize that this is unwinnable, and they back off from it. But certainly a setback for the British Empire. Thank you.